The candles at Ashcombe Hall burned lowest over the great chair at the head of the dining room, and it was there, on the last Tuesday of October, that Marianne Hale learned she was to be sold. No one used that word. The Dowager Countess spoke instead of settlement and security. Of a fortunate arrangement. Of a girl in Marianne's situation being grateful for the notice of a man like Mr. Silas Grant. Mr. Grant himself said very little. He sat with his wine untouched, and his gaze fixed on Marianne the way a man studies a horse he intends to buy, cataloguing the line of her shoulders, the steadiness of her hands, whether she would do. At the head of the table, in the chair that had belonged to the old Earl, and to the Earl before him, sat Edmund Ashworth. He wore the signet ring that was not, by any right, older than 8 months, his to wear. He lifted his glass to the arrangement, as though it cost him nothing at all. "A girl, with no more claim on this house than the housemaid," the Dowager said to Mr. Grant, not troubling to lower her voice. "Cannot afford to be particular." She smiled at Marianne as she said it, the smile of a woman certain she was being kind. Marianne kept her eyes on her plate and her hands folded in her lap, and beneath the table, where no one could see, her fingers found the thin ribbon at her throat and the small, hard shape it carried. She did not answer. She had learned, in 8 months under this roof, that silence cost her less than speech. Above the mantel, in a portrait no one in the room troubled to look at anymore, a young officer in regimentals looked out at the table with an expression the painter had caught before he understood what war would ask of him. Julian Ashworth had been dead, by every account the family accepted, for 18 months. The chair beneath his portrait had not stood empty for even 8 of them. You may already have a guess about what a house does with a chair when it believes its rightful heir will never come to claim it again. Stay, and see whether you have guessed correctly. "I will expect an answer within the fortnight," Edmund said. And the candle flame beside him bent as though the house itself flinched. Though it was only the draught from the hall door, opened and closed. And no one at the table thought to wonder who had opened it. Mr. Grant set down his glass and studied Marianne a moment longer, the way a buyer studies terms already half agreed. "You need not decide tonight, Miss Hale," he said, not unkindly, though there was nothing in it that resembled true kindness either. "I am a patient man, where a good investment is concerned. I have found patience is generally repaid." "How fortunate for you," Marianne said, and kept her voice as level as the silver beside her plate, "that you have never yet had to be patient for anything you truly wanted." A ripple of something passed down the table at that, not quite laughter, and the Dowager's mouth tightened at a companion who had dared a reply at all. Edmund's fingers drummed once against the stem of his glass, a small habitual motion that had belonged, Marianne thought, without quite knowing why the memory surfaced, to his brother first. 8 months earlier, Marianne had arrived at Ashcombe Hall with 1 trunk, 1 black gown for a father, 6 weeks buried, and a letter of introduction from a clergyman who had died owing more in kindness than he had ever owned in coin. She was 23, the daughter of a country vicar who had educated her better than his living could justify, and she had exactly 1 living relation willing to acknowledge her. A Dowager Countess who required, as it happened, a companion who read well aloud, wrote a legible hand, and asked for nothing beyond her keep. The position suited what remained of Marianne's pride, which was considerable, and what remained of her circumstances, which were not. She rose before the house woke to see to the Dowager's correspondence. She sat with her through headaches that were sometimes real and sometimes convenient. She learned, within a month, which of the family's debts the servants were not paid to know about, because a companion who manages a household's letters manages its secrets whether she wishes to or not. She learned this in particular. The old Earl had died in February. of a chill that turned to fever in a fortnight, and Edmund had stepped into the earldom the way a man steps into a coat, cut for someone else, filling it out through will rather than fit. He had inherited debts alongside the title, debts his father had managed by never speaking of them, and Edmund managed by borrowing further. Mr. Silas Grant, who owned 3 mills in the north and a good deal of paper bearing the Ashworth name, had begun calling at Ashcombe with a frequency that had nothing to do with friendship. Marianne understood, by midsummer, precisely what she was being kept for. She understood it the way one understands weather, as a fact to be endured rather than argued with. And she went on rising before dawn and reading aloud and keeping her own counsel, because the alternative was a workhouse or a stranger's charity worse than this one. Her days had taken a shape she could have recited in her sleep. She woke before the house stirred and carried the dowager's chocolate up herself, rather than ring for a maid who resented the errand, because a kindness cost her nothing, and bought her, on the worst mornings, a measure of goodwill she could spend later. She answered letters in a hand the dowager pronounced tolerable, which was, from that quarter, high praise. In the hour before dinner, she sat with Mrs. Prewitt in the housekeeper's small warm room off the kitchen passage, the one place in the house where no one troubled to lower a voice or arrange a face. "You will wear yourself thin, miss, running letters and headaches and now soup to Jacob besides," Mrs. Prewitt told her one such evening, setting a cup of tea in front of her with more force than the gesture strictly required. "This house has never once thanked you for any of it, and I have watched it not thank you for the better part of a year." "It does not need to thank me," Marianne said. "It only needs to keep me." "That is not the same as being valued, and you know it as well as I do." Mrs. Prewitt's voice gentled. "I knew the old Earl 40 years, and I knew Colonel Julian before he was ever a colonel. When he was a boy who would sooner muddy his good coat helping a stableman than sit still for a portrait. He would not have stood by and watched this house use you so, if he had lived to see it." Marianne had said nothing to that, only turned her teacup slowly in its saucer, because the housekeeper did not know about the ribbon at her throat, and there was no way to explain a grief 18 months old without unraveling further than she could afford to unravel in company, even Mrs. Prewitt's. She had not always been kept for anything. Before her father's death, before the black gown and the single trunk, there had been a summer at the vicarage when Julian, then merely a colonel home on leave, and not yet the tragedy the family toasted at Christmas, had ridden out most mornings to a parish he had no particular business visiting. He had never declared himself. There had been no understanding between them that either party could have named aloud in company, only a summer of small kindnesses, a book left with a page turned down, a horse walked slowly so its rider might prolong a conversation about nothing at all. On the morning he rode for the coast, and the transport waiting there, he had pressed something into her hand at the vicarage gate, and closed her fingers over it before she could look. "Keep it safe for me," he had said, and had not said for what, or for how long, or whether he meant to come back and ask for it again. She had worn it on a ribbon under her collar every day since, through her father's death and her own arrival at Ashcombe, through the black-bordered letter that came 18 months later, informing the family that Colonel Ashworth had been lost in the retreat from a village whose name none of them could pronounce correctly. She had not shown the ring to anyone at Ashcombe. She had not told them what it meant, because she did not know herself what it had meant, only that she had promised to keep it, and that keeping it was the last thing he had ever asked of her. He had walked, in the end, a distance he no longer troubled to calculate in miles, because the number had stopped meaning anything useful somewhere in the second month. He had crossed rivers by whatever bridge or ferry or borrowed boat a few coins or a day's labor could secure, had slept in barns and once in a burned church whose roof had fallen in just enough to let the rain find him anyway, and had eaten, on the worst stretch of the journey. Whatever a farmer's wife would spare a stranger too proud to admit how little he had left. None of it had troubled him half so much as the nights, early on, when sleep brought him back to a river crossing in Spain, and a lieutenant's face going under water that should not have been deep enough to take him. A man came to the servants' entrance of Ashcombe Hall on the evening before the dinner, where Marianne would be told to expect Mr. Grant's proposal within the fortnight, though no one in the family knew it yet. He came on foot, in a greatcoat too thin for October, with a beard he had not troubled to shave in weeks, and a limp he had not troubled to explain to anyone, because there had been no one on the road worth explaining it to. He did not go to the front door. He stood in the shadow of the old stable block, where a boy named Tom Reeve was rubbing down a mare by lantern light, and he watched the windows of the great house light one by one, as the family dressed for dinner, and he did not go in. He told himself it was caution. 18 months in a French prison, and 4 months walking home across a continent that had forgotten the shape of peace, teach a man to be careful about the rooms he enters and the welcomes he assumes. He told himself he wished to know what he was returning to before he announced that he had returned at all. He did not tell himself, though it was equally true, that he was afraid of what 18 months might have done to a promise made at a garden gate. He walked instead, in the last gray light, along the lane that led to the tenant cottages, because it was the only walk in the county his feet still remembered without thinking, and it was there, at the window of old Jacob Miller's cottage, that he stopped and did not walk on. Marianne sat by Jacob's fire with a bowl of soup she had carried from the great house's kitchen under her own cloak, because the housekeeper would not have sanctioned it, and the dowager would have called it waste. She held the old groom's hand while he ate, slowly, his fingers too unsteady now to manage the spoon alone, and she read to him from a worn Bible in a voice pitched low and even, the voice of someone who had done this before and would do it again, and expected no thanks for either. "You did not have to come again, miss," Jacob said when she paused. "Not with the house full of company tomorrow. The house will still be full of company the day after," Marianne said, and there was, for just a moment, something dry and unbowed in it, a small private humor she permitted almost no one else to see. "You will not. You ought to save your kindness for someone who can pay you back in something better than a groom's thanks," Jacob said, though his fingers tightened gratefully around hers as he said it. "I have never yet found kindness improved by keeping accounts," she answered, and settled the shawl more securely at his shoulders before returning to the page, her voice dropping again into that low and even register she kept for the reading, a voice that made no demand of the man listening beyond his willingness to rest. The man at the window did not move for a long while. He had left England a colonel with a title waiting for him, and a girl at a garden gate who had said nothing and promised everything, and he had come home to find the title given away and the girl carrying soup under her cloak to a dying groom because no one else in his family's house would trouble to. He understood, watching her, something he had not fully understood in 8 years of knowing her. He understood what she was, entirely apart from what anyone had told him to think of her. He did not go in. Not yet. He walked back to the stable block in the dark and told Tom Reeve, in a voice the boy did not at first recognize, to say nothing to anyone until morning. He came to the house at first light, and it was Mrs. Prewitt, the housekeeper, who opened the side door to him and stood for 3 full seconds with her hand pressed flat to her chest before she found her voice enough to say his name. Edmund received his brother in the study, not the dining room, because Edmund understood before Julian had finished crossing the threshold that whatever was about to happen should not happen where the servants could hear it. He stood behind the desk that had been their father's, and did not come around it, and did not offer his hand. "You are supposed to be dead," Edmund said. "I am aware," Julian said. "I have had 18 months to grow accustomed to the idea myself." Edmund's color did not change so much as fix, the way a man's expression fixes when he is deciding, in real time, which version of himself the next 5 minutes require. "You will understand," he said carefully, "that the house has made certain arrangements, certain necessary arrangements, in your absence. I understand that you are sitting in my father's chair," Julian said without raising his voice, "and that you have apparently arranged to sell the vicar's daughter to a mill owner to pay for the privilege. She is nobody, Julian." Edmund's voice sharpened, the way a man's does when a private cruelty is dragged into daylight and made to answer for itself. "A poor relation with a dead father and no fortune. You cannot mean to concern yourself with her." "I concerned myself with her before you concerned yourself with a title that was never legally yours to spend," Julian said. "Do not mistake my patience for permission, Edmund. I have not yet decided what to do with you. I have decided a great deal already about what I will not permit to happen to her." He did not raise his voice through any of it. He did not need to. Edmund had spent 8 months speaking to a room that could not answer him back, and he had forgotten, in that time, the particular quality of his brother's stillness, the way Julian's calm had always been the loudest thing in any room he occupied. Julian did not go to Marianne that first morning. He told himself it was strategy, that a man returned from the dead required time to secure his claim before he complicated it with sentiment a hostile household could use against him. He sat instead with Mrs. Prewitt over tea that had gone cold in the pot, and let her tell him, in the careful shorthand of a servant who has learned exactly how much truth a household can bear, what the last 18 months had cost the people he had left behind. If you have ever watched a room decide, quietly and over many months, that a person does not matter, you already know how heavy that decision becomes for the person carrying it. Julian was about to learn precisely how heavy. He learned, from Mrs. Prewitt, why he had waited 18 months to come home at all, though the truer answer to that question he had not yet said aloud to anyone. He had not been merely delayed. He had been captured within a week of the retreat that killed most of his company, held in conditions he did not describe to Mrs. Prewitt and would not, for a long while, describe to anyone. He had escaped in the spring, walked most of a continent to reach a port that would take him, and arrived at every stage of that walk carrying the memory of a young lieutenant named Hartley who had frozen at a river crossing under Julian's own order, a crossing Julian had judged safe, and had not been. Hartley had been 21. He had a mother in Shropshire who still, so far as Julian knew, believed her son had died of fever rather than of a captain's misjudged confidence in a current. Julian had carried that misjudgment the whole walk home, past every milestone that should have quickened his pace toward England, and had found, at each one, a fresh reason to delay a return that would require him to be, again, a man other people trusted to decide things correctly. He had written the mother a letter twice in the long months of captivity, and burned both attempts before he could finish them. Because every version he drafted arrived, by its 3rd paragraph, at the same unbearable sentence, the admission that her son had trusted his colonel's judgment, and his colonel's judgment had been wrong. He had told himself, in the prison and on the road afterward, that a man who could not yet write that sentence to a stranger had no business appearing at a garden gate to ask a living woman to trust him with anything at all. He had not written ahead because a letter would have asked someone to believe him alive before he had decided, himself, that he deserved to be. He had told no one at the ports, where he might have sent word, because the first person he told would have asked him to explain the 18 months. and he had not yet found words for Hartley that did not sound like an excuse. It was Marianne, in the end, who found him first. In the library where he had gone to be alone with a family Bible, whose front page listed a death that had not, after all, occurred. She stood in the doorway a long moment before he heard her. "They told me you were in the study with Edmund," she said. "Mrs. Prewitt would not say more than that you had come home." He turned, and for a moment neither of them managed a single word. She had changed in 18 months in the particular ways grief and hard usage change a person. Thinner through the face, more careful in the set of her shoulders, and entirely, unmistakably herself. "I kept it," she said, before he could speak, and her hand went to the ribbon at her throat. "I did not know what else to do with it. I did not know if you would ever come to ask for it again." Marianne. It was the first time he had said her given name aloud since the vicarage gate, and the room seemed to hold itself still around the word. "I did not know if I had any right to come and ask." She crossed the room to him, not quickly, and stood close enough that he could see the ribbon's small knot at the back of her neck. "You should sit," she said, low, because his hand had found the edge of the desk and gripped it the way a man grips something to keep from swaying. "You have walked a great distance to be lectured by your brother in his own study. Sit, and let me send for something, and you may tell me only as much as you wish to." It was, in its way, the same command his own rank had once given him 100 times over, the order that was truly care-wearing a soldier's clothes. He obeyed her, and found that being ordered gently was a mercy he had not known. Until that moment, he still had the capacity to receive. He did not tell her about Hartley that morning. He told her only that he had been a prisoner, and that the walk home had been long, and she did not press him for the parts he withheld, because she had learned, in a house that specialized in extracting confessions for use against their owner, the particular kindness of not asking. "You may take back what you left me," she said instead, her fingers at the ribbon's knot. "Whatever it was meant to be, it was meant for a promise you may no longer wish to keep, and I would not hold you to a boy's understanding made at a garden gate." "Leave it where it is," Julian said. "I meant it as a promise then. I have had 18 months and a continent to walk across in which to decide I mean it a good deal more now." He studied her a moment longer, the shadows under her eyes, the careful thinness of her wrists above her gloves. "Eat something today, Marianne. Properly, not standing at a sideboard between letters. I mean to see to it myself if I must. That is a very large concern for a man who arrived this morning with nothing but a beard and a limp," she said, though the corner of her mouth had already begun, against her own better judgment, to soften. "I have a great deal of time to make up," he said. "I intend to begin with your dinner." He did not kiss her. He wanted to, and the wanting sat in his chest with a heat that startled him after so long a season of feeling nothing at all, a season in which he had trained himself, deliberately, to want nothing beyond the next dry patch of road and the next safe place to sleep. He had forgotten, walking that long way home, that a body could still ask for something other than survival. He took her hand instead, turned it over, and pressed his mouth briefly to the inside of her wrist, where her pulse beat visibly against the thin skin, unsteady and entirely unhidden, and felt his own breath catch to match it before he mastered himself again. She did not pull away. She stood very still, the way she had learned to stand still in this house for 8 months. Only this time, the stillness held nothing of concealment in it, only the effort of a woman deciding, in real time, that she no longer needed to guard what her body was telling him. "Soon," he said, and did not explain what he meant by it, and did not need to. The Dowager Countess learned of her elder son's return before noon, and by the time she descended to the drawing room, her face had arranged itself into an expression of maternal relief so complete that Marianne, watching from the corner where a companion was expected to remain nearly invisible, could not tell whether any of it was genuine. "My son," the Dowager said, both hands extended to Julian as though 18 months of silence had been a minor inconvenience of the post. "We had given you up. We had held a service." "So I understand," Julian said, and allowed her to embrace him, and did not soften the set of his jaw while she did it. "You will wish to rest," the Dowager went on, already turning the conversation the way a woman turns a difficult horse, gently and with practiced hands. "There will be time enough to sort out the tiresome business of the estate once you have recovered your strength. Edmund has managed admirably in your absence. It would be unkind, I think, to disturb the arrangements he has made too abruptly. And you will not, I think, wish to trouble yourself over Miss Hale's small affairs on your very first day home. She is a companion, Julian. Nothing more. A girl of no fortune and no family to speak of, who has been fed and housed here on charity alone. It would be a great deal of concern to spend on so little." "The arrangement concerning Miss Hale," Julian said, "will be disturbed immediately." The Dowager's smile did not falter, but something behind it did. "Miss Hale is a companion, Julian, and a poor relation of no particular consequence to the family's future. I understand you knew her a little before the war. Young men form attachments in idle summers that do not survive a return to sense. You have a great deal of sense to return to now." "I have returned to a great deal more clarity than I left with," Julian said, "and none of it inclines me to sell a vicar's daughter to settle my brother's debts." The Dowager's mouth thinned, but she said nothing further in that hour, because she had learned, across 2 sons and 40 years of managing an earldom's fortunes, precisely when a battle could not yet be won, and must instead be postponed. It could not be postponed for long. Edmund, cornered by his brother's return, and by debts that would not wait politely for Julian to settle a claim, moved within the week to accelerate what he could not prevent. He wrote to the family's solicitor disputing Julian's identity outright, suggesting the war had produced an impostor, or worse, a man so altered by captivity that his judgment could not be trusted with an earldom's affairs. He wrote, on the same day, to Mr. Grant, urging that the betrothal be settled at once, before any inconvenient legal delay could interfere with it. Mr. Aldous Finch, who had served the Ashworth family's affairs for the better part of 30 years and had known Julian since the boy was breeched, read Edmund's letter twice at his chambers in the county town, and then set it aside without troubling to answer it in writing at all. He came to Ashcombe instead, in person, and spent the better part of an afternoon with Julian in the study, examining scars a French surgeon had left, and a signet ring Julian had somehow kept, through 18 months of captivity, by the simple expedient of never once letting it leave his own body. Finch left that evening satisfied beyond any reasonable doubt, and said so plainly to Edmund on his way out, in a tone that made clear the matter of identity, whatever else remained unsettled between the brothers, was no longer open to dispute. That refusal did not slow Edmund's other campaign. He called on Mr. Grant twice more that week, and each time returned to Ashcombe a little more determined that the betrothal papers be signed before Julian's claim could be formally recorded, as though a signature obtained quickly enough might yet outrun a truth already established. "He is not himself," Marianne overheard the Dowager say to a visiting cousin, in the hushed and satisfied tone of a woman delivering unwelcome news she does not entirely regret. 18 months in a French prison. One cannot expect a man to return unchanged. Edmund fears, and I confess I share the fear, that my elder son's mind has not survived what his body did. It was the second time the family had found a way to make Marianne small in company, though this time the words were aimed past her at Julian, and she felt them land regardless, the old familiar chill of being spoken of as though she could not hear. 3 days later, at a dinner Edmund had arranged specifically to present Mr. Grant's suit as a settled matter before any legal challenge to Julian's claim could be resolved, a guest new to the county leaned toward his neighbor and asked, in the carrying whisper of a man who believes himself discreet, who the pale girl was at the foot of the table. "Nobody of consequence," came the answer, from a woman Marianne did not know and would not afterward be able to name. "A poor relation the family keeps out of charity. I hear she is to be married off to settle the young earl's debts. Convenient, is it not? Having a girl no one will miss." Marianne heard it clearly. She had heard variations of it all her life at Ashcombe, from the dowager at her own table and from Edmund in his own study. And this third voicing, from a stranger who meant nothing by it beyond idle dinner conversation, was somehow the one that reached furthest because it confirmed what she had feared since the first week under this roof. She was, to everyone at this table who was not Julian Ashworth, entirely disposable. She excused herself before the fish course and stood a long moment in the corridor outside the dining room with her back against the cold paneling, willing her hands to stop their small betraying tremor. She did not weep. She had not wept, she realized, in 8 months, not once, and she was not going to begin now, in a corridor where anyone might come upon her and mistake grief for weakness. Julian found her there. He did not ask what was wrong, because he had heard the woman's remark himself. 3 seats down, and had spent the length of the fish course deciding precisely what he intended to do about it. "I am well," Marianne said before he could speak. The old reflex of a companion trained never to be any trouble to anyone. His hand rose toward her face, close enough that she felt the warmth of it, before it touched her, and stopped a bare inch from her cheek, as though he had only just remembered they stood in a public corridor with a dinner unfinished a few yards away. "I have wanted to do that since the library," he said, low, an admission he had clearly not meant to make aloud. "I have wanted a great many things since the library that I have had no business wanting, until my name and my claim were settled beyond argument. I find I am done waiting for either." "You are not obliged to be well tonight," Julian said, "and I am no longer obliged to sit quietly through my brother's dinner while a stranger appraises you like a horse. He did not come to buy." He took her hand, briefly, and did not let go so quickly this time. "Come back in with me. Not to endure it. To end it." She looked up at him, and something in her face, some old carefulness she had worn so long she had nearly forgotten it was armor rather than skin, loosened for just a moment. "You cannot end 8 months in the length of a dinner, Julian." "No," he agreed, "but I can end it tonight, and let the rest mend at its own pace." He offered his arm. "Will you come and watch me try?" The dining room had gone quiet by the time they returned, the particular quiet of a room that senses, before it fully understands, that something has shifted in its architecture. Edmund stood at the head of the table, Mr. Grant beside him with a paper half unfolded, betrothal terms Edmund had clearly meant to have signed before the sweet course. Julian crossed the room in a handful of strides, not hurried, not raised in temper, only entirely certain, and stopped beside the great chair his brother occupied. "You are sitting in my chair, Edmund," he said, quietly enough that the whole table leaned in to hear it, loudly enough that no one mistook it for a private remark. "I will thank you to stand." Edmund stood. He had spent 8 months learning to fill a chair that did not belong to him, and he had never, in all that time, learned how to hold his ground against a brother who asked for nothing twice. Julian did not sit immediately. He turned instead to Mr. Grant, whose paper had gone still in his hand, and to the Dowager, whose composure had, for the first time in Marianne's 8 months of knowing her, entirely deserted her face. "This is my chair," Julian said, and the room held its breath around the words. "Miss Hale is my choice." It was not a speech. It cost him, Marianne would understand later, a great deal more than its brevity suggested. But he had learned, across 18 months of captivity and 4 months of walking, precisely how few words a true thing required. Around the table, the same guests who had spent the fish course speculating about the pale girl at the foot of the table now watched her with an attention that had shifted, in the space of one sentence, from idle curiosity to something closer to recognition. The woman who had called Marianne nobody of consequence set down her spoon and did not pick it up again for the rest of the meal. Mr. Grant folded his paper without another word and reached for his hat before the second course could be cleared. The Dowager's hand, still raised in some half-formed protest, dropped slowly into her lap, and for the first time since Marianne had known her, she said nothing at all. Mr. Finch, summoned again that same afternoon, and waiting, at Julian's private instruction, in the hall beyond the dining-room door, stepped forward now with the papers that confirmed, formally and beyond any dispute Edmund's letters could sustain, the identity and the standing of the Earl of Ashcombe returned. He laid them on the table beside Edmund's half-signed betrothal contract, and the contrast between the two documents said, more plainly than any further words could, precisely how the evening would end. Edmund did not argue. Something in his face, watching his brother's hand rest briefly and without possessiveness on the back of the great chair, seemed almost relieved. The particular relief of a man finally permitted to set down a weight he had never wanted to carry in the first place. He had spent 8 months learning the particular loneliness of a title that was not truly his, signing his father's name in all but ink to documents he barely understood, and receiving, for all his effort, nothing warmer from his own mother than the cool approval of a woman who had always preferred her elder son, and had simply made the best of the one circumstance left to her. "I did not want the chair, Julian," he said, low, meant for his brother alone, though half the table heard it. "I wanted only not to be the son who let the house fall, once you were gone." "You need not have carried it alone," Julian said, and there was no triumph in it, only a tiredness that matched his brother's own. "We will speak of the debts tomorrow, and of the future after that. Tonight I would like, if no one objects, to sit down to a dinner I have been 18 months in returning to eat." The Dowager, still silent, still pale, rose without a word, and left the room before the next course arrived, and no one at the table pretended not to understand why. It was, Marianne thought, watching her go, the quietest and most complete correction she had ever witnessed, delivered without a single raised voice. Winter came early to Ashcombe that year, and by the second week of December, the ground beyond the library windows had gone white and hard, and the fires in every hearth were kept high against a cold that pressed close to the old stone walls without ever quite finding its way in. Marianne sat in the great chair's shadow on a December evening with a book open and largely unread in her lap, watching Julian oversee, with a patience she had not known him to possess before the war, and had come to love precisely because it had cost him so much to learn, the settlement of accounts with a tenant whose roof needed mending before the frost worsened. Edmund sat across the hearth from them both, no longer at the table's head, but not banished from it either, learning slowly and without much grace what it meant to be a second son who had once tried, briefly and badly, to be a first. The ring that had traveled a continent on a ribbon under Marianne's collar now sat plainly on her hand, where anyone in the house might see it, and understand exactly what it meant. Julian had placed it there himself in November, in the same library where she had found him newly returned and uncertain of his welcome. And he had not made a speech of it then either. Only taken her hand and told her, in the same low voice he had used at the vicarage gate 8 years before, that he did not intend to ask her to keep it safe for him any longer. He intended to keep it, and her himself. Mrs. Prewitt had wept, briefly and without apology, when Julian told her over cold tea in her small warm room that the wedding would take place before spring, and had informed him, in the same breath, that she had known it would come to this, since the day he rode out to a country parish. He had no particular business visiting, 8 years before anyone else in the family thought to notice. Jacob's cottage had a new roof by the first snow, and Mary Ann still walked the lane most afternoons with soup under her cloak, though now no one at Ashcombe thought to call it waste. Tom had been given a place in the stables proper, at Julian's word, for the discretion of a boy who had known, before anyone else in the county, that the dead sometimes come home. On the last evening before Christmas, Julian took the great chair for the first time since the dinner that had ended his brother's borrowed reign, and drew Mary Ann down beside him, rather than to a seat of her own, her hand resting easily in his against the worn arm of a chair that had waited, through 18 months of mourning and a false claimant's brief tenancy, for exactly this. The portrait above the mantel looked down at them both, the young officer's uncertain face no longer a stranger to the room he watched over. And outside the tall windows the snow went on falling, soft and unhurried, on a house that had, at long last, remembered whose it was. If Mary Ann's journey has moved you, I hope you will carry a little of her quiet courage with you when you go. Thank you for staying until the end.